Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Chinese Revolution area of study 2. This video will outline the Korean War, which took place from 1950 to 1951, with the bulk of the fighting happening in 1950 and from 1950 to 1953, with the bulk of the fighting happening in 1950 and 1951. So here's a quote from Zhou Enlai, the premier. The Chinese people absolutely will not tolerate foreign aggression, nor will they tolerate seeing their neighbors invaded by imperialists. So let's start off by looking at North Korean ambitions. So after Japan was defeated in August 1945, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel. Now, the 38th parallel is it's a line of latitude similar to like the equator that separated the North from the South. There was a communist government under Kim Il-sung in the North and an American-backed government in the South. Kim hoped to match Mao's success and unite Korea under communist rule. He was strengthened by having Soviet military equipment and was further encouraged by the fact that on the 12th of January 1950, the US Secretary of State announced that South Korea and Taiwan lay outside the United States' international interests, i.e., the US weren't too concerned what was happening in Korea and Taiwan. In 1949, Kim had raised the possibility of waging war with South Korea, discussing it with Stalin from the USSR. This was approved by Stalin. However, Stalin warned Kim, "If you should get kicked in the teeth, I shall not lift a finger. You have to ask Mao for all the help." However, Mao was unaware of this statement by Stalin when he gave his support for Kim's planned attack on the South, and Kim Il-sung never told Mao that Russia was not going to lift a finger if they should get kicked in the teeth. So Mao was ready to provide support. Stalin was not, and Kim was very eager to invade the South. So on the 25th of June, 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel, marking the beginning of the Korean War. They made quick gains, and Seoul, the current capital of South Korea, fell in only 3 days, so on the 28th of June. US President Harry Truman secured UN backing for intervention because at this point he was concerned about the likelihood that all of Korea could come under communist rule. And so on the 15th of September 1950, the American military and their Western allies launched a counteroffensive, capturing the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung at this point begged Mao for help. Now, Mao and the CCP didn't leap in to help, but they did interpret the US invasion as an example of Western imperialism, something that they could not stand for, which threatened China's sovereignty, considering North Korea bordered China. Stalin also agreed to involve the Soviet Air Force, though he quickly reneged on this agreement. So Mao and the CCP debated what they should do. And eventually, Mao was keen to offer support to Kim, and eventually his side won out, and they did provide support. So on the 15th of October 1950, the People's Volunteers, which was an army of 350,000 troops led by Peng Dehui, they were basically a volunteer army from the People's Liberation Army. They crossed the Yalu River, which was the separation between China and North Korea, and joined the war. The Americans, led by General Douglas MacArthur, underestimated the Chinese forces, believing them to have an army of only 10,000 versus the 350,000 that they actually had. General MacArthur famously said, "We'll get the boys home by Christmas," thinking that this was going to be an easy and swift war. On the 25th of November 1950, 200,000 Chinese troops launched an offensive. So they were 200,000 from the original 350,000, forcing the US to retreat south. In just 7 weeks, North Korea was retaken, and in January, Seoul was recaptured by the communists. However, 500,000 Chinese soldiers died in battle or from exposure to minus 30-degree temperatures, including Mao's eldest son, who was fighting in Korea. In January 1951, UN forces launched a counterattack and fought to a stalemate at the 38th parallel. An informal ceasefire was called in July 1951, though it took 2 more years for a formal armistice to be signed. So the 38th parallel was a line of latitude, and the border between North and South Korea today sits roughly on the 38th parallel. So that's basically where the separation between North and South is to this day. In 1951, so this is consequences of the Korean War. In 1951, the USA sponsored a UN resolution that declared China to be the aggressor in Korea. This led to the enforcement of embargoes against China, which made the PRC more reliant on Soviet support. So it didn't have great consequences for China. The PRC was excluded from the UN until the 1970s, and China was represented by Jiang's Republic of China based in Taiwan. So this led Jiang Jiechi's government in Taiwan to have more international standing, and the PRC to be sort of shunned from the international stage by being excluded from the UN. During the Korean War, America vowed to support Taiwan in the event of any future communist aggression, which basically put an end to any hopes that Mao had of pursuing Jiang and his nationalist comrades in Taiwan, because Mao knew that if they attacked Taiwan, then America would lend military support. The Korean War ultimately cost the PRC dearly, and Mao later admitted that the war was a mistake, claiming that it was 100% wrong. The economic cost of the war was also great. In 1952, Mao said, "Last year, i.e. 1951, what we spent on the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea more or less equaled our expenditures for national reconstruction." So this is a time, 2 years into the PRC, when Mao was committed to rebuilding China, and they spent just as much on their involvement in the Korean War as they did on rebuilding society. So it was basically, the Korean War was a terrible loss for the PRC, an early loss in the existence of the PRC. So here is a brief summary of the Korean War. So some challenges for the communists. After repelling a North Korean invasion of South Korea, US forces invaded North Korea. This was a threat on Chinese sovereignty. The CCP interpreted this as such, and Stalin promised to provide air cover for a counteroffensive, but went back on that offer. The communist response on the 15th of October 1950, 350,000 PLA soldiers, officially called People's Volunteers, entered North Korea and repelled the US invasion. The Chinese public exhorted to resist America, aid Korea, which helped the CCP justify repressive mass campaigns. So they're going to be in our next couple of videos, will be on some of the campaigns that were launched by the CCP in China. And the outcome of all of this intervention was a source of national pride, as the CCP had successfully defended China from Western imperialism. However, ultimately, the Korean War was a mistake for China, and it was incredibly costly, with China providing 95% of the soldiers and most of the funding for the North Korean war effort, and 500,000 Chinese soldiers killed, including Mao's son, not to mention, as I mentioned before, the economic cost of the war. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and I will see you next time.